Hi everyone. There's a bit of a story about this video, so just bear with me while I go through what's happened. So I started recording a video last week, and the video was going to be starting to look at level 2 counselling studies, and I was going to start at unit 1 and we were going to cover criteria 1.1, which is working within an ethical framework as a counsellor. And I recorded the video, and it was a 37-minute long video. I uploaded it to my laptop and I started editing it, and then I realized my sound cuts out. So there had been an issue with this mic communicating with my phone, and I think this was on Monday last week. I was so frustrated because it felt like 40 minutes of my life. I just hadn't realized that the sound had shut off. So bearing in mind, the video was on the ethical framework for the counselling professions. Here, the BACP Ethical Framework. And I was going through the elements of that, explaining why it was important, explaining how it related to client work to help with your studies. And then on Tuesday, the very next day, the BACP announced that this ethical framework, which has been in place for the last 8 years, since 2018, had been updated. So there's now a 2026 ethical framework for the counselling professions as of Tuesday. So actually, the video that I originally recorded for you, had I have uploaded that on Monday evening as I intended to, it would have been made completely redundant within 12 hours. So in a way, it's almost like the universe conspired in my favour. So we're going to redo the video, but I'm going to be talking about the new ethical framework. And in a way, it's quite interesting because this is brand new to me. I've been working within this ethical framework throughout my counsellor training whilst in practice. Now I teach level 2 students, and my teaching material is referring to the 2018 ethical framework. Together, we'll look at this new one. Okay. But before I start, for those doing your level 2 certificate in counselling skills, Unit 1 is all about working ethically and safely as a counsellor, understanding what that is and understanding why it's important. So in a previous video, I explained that the counselling profession in the UK is not regulated. So actually the title counsellor and therapist, they're not protected titles, which means technically anybody could advertise themselves as a therapist, let's say on Instagram, and they could go into private practice and charge money for their service despite having no qualifications. Obviously, that is not ethical. It's not safe practice, but ultimately, if you were to do that, you wouldn't get very far because you need insurance, you need a clinical supervisor, you need to be registered with a counselling body like the BACP or the UKCP. So in the first instance, the fact that you've sought out training demonstrates that you recognise a ethical responsibility to your clients. That shows you have the integrity, honesty, trustworthiness, compassion, many of the ethical traits that you need to be a counsellor. So as part of your training, you will often, well, as regularly as possible, refer back to the ethical framework. Now, the new ethical framework, as of 2026, is split into 3 sections. And the first one is about working ethically within relationships. So that's thinking about the relationship between the therapist and the client, looking at boundaries, looking at how to treat somebody with respect, looking at anti-oppressive practice, which I'll go into, looking about the client's autonomy, looking at our own agendas that could come into the room as a therapist versus following the agenda of the client, for example. The next part is looking at ethical principles, and I'll go through what those new principles are, because in this 2026 ethical framework, there are 12 principles, whereas in the 2018 one, there were 6. And finally, there is a section on the core responsibilities of a counsellor. And before I go further into this video, I just want to say, you might be sitting there thinking, this sounds bloody boring. Maybe you're here just to hear me talk, or maybe you are here to top up what you've learned about Unit 1, particularly Criteria 1.1, which is what I'm referring to. But I hope, as I think a lot of my level 2 students do experience. I hope that this is almost quite inspiring because the ethical framework really celebrates the client and what they bring, but it also gives a good framework as to what we bring as counselors and therapists and what we stand for. And I actually think sometimes, if only, this is a bit cheeky, if only people in positions of power, if only they had an ethical framework like this, because this helps to make decisions. It considers human rights, it considers legal issues, it considers autonomy, it considers trustworthiness, transparency, honesty. The fact that counsellors are held up to this ethical standard of practice. I wish there were other professions that had that. I'm sure doctors and nurses and lawyers have their own ethical frameworks naturally, but I really like it and I think it's quite a nice thing to go through in some ways. So I hope you enjoy this. So I'll start with the ethical principles of the counselling profession. So as I said, there are 12. I'm just going to go through them quite simply so this doesn't turn into a very boring video. The first ethical principle is confidentiality. And of course, within the counselling profession, if the work you're doing with a therapist is not confidential, the trust is gone straight away. Nobody is going to come to a counselling session knowing that it's being live streamed, or knowing that the notes that are made are just going to be shared with somebody later, or knowing that whatever you confide in your therapist about, they're just going to tell their partner about at the pub later. So everything that happens within counselling has to be confidential. And actually, there are not many areas in modern life where confidentiality is truly respected. Even with your partner, you're not contractually bound to keep things between you or to keep things a secret. There's nothing to say your partner won't talk to a friend about what you've shared or talk to a parent or something like that. In therapy, it's of utmost importance that confidentiality is upheld, and that also allows the client to really say things that they may never have said to anyone, or say things that they can't say to another person. There are limits to confidentiality because if you kept absolutely everything confidential and didn't tell anybody, that would then become unethical. I'll go through this in more detail in its own separate video because it's really important. We know the limits of confidentiality, but just to give a very rogue example. So let's say that you were speaking with a client and they told you that they were planning an act of terrorism in the town centre next weekend. And they had the means to do it, they had the plans to do it, and the counselling session is completely confidential. So you hear this and you don't do anything, you don't tell anybody. That would be unethical because it's a matter of public interest that you break confidentiality, you speak to the police, you speak to a supervisor. And when you do that, it's important to tell the client. In some cases, not in all cases, it might not be appropriate, but to communicate with them and say, what you just said to me would give me reason to inform authorities because that is a matter of public interest and I have a duty of care not only to you but towards other people. The only ethical thing to do in that situation would be to break confidentiality under those grounds. The next principle is honesty. There are two principles, so honesty and transparency. And to me, they sound very similar. But I suppose you can be honest about something and you can tell sort of a white lie, or you can hold back information. Does that make any sense? So as a counsellor, as a therapist, you have to be honest. And things you have to be honest about are your level of qualification. You need to be honest and transparent with the client if, for whatever reason, you might be using AI as a tool. If you were to use such a tool, you need to be honest and transparent about what you're using it for. You need to tell the client if you're inputting any of their data or anything that they've confided in you about. If you're putting that into an AI tool, you need to get consent from the client and you need to be honest about you doing that. You need to be honest and transparent with the client about anything that hasn't gone well or hasn't gone right with your work together, or a mistake that you've made. It's more ethical to say, I'm so sorry, I've completely made a mistake, but it's important to be honest and transparent because if you're not, and you lie and it comes back to you later, that's really going to damage the counselling relationship. Part of honesty and transparency also links to keeping the appropriate records about clients. And the way we do this is completely confidential. So there will be no identifying factors in the client notes that you make. But it's important that you do make some notes of some sort so that you can be held accountable for the work you're doing. But records must be appropriate, they must be truthful, and you must be honest about the work you're doing. If you get to a point where you are paid for being a counsellor or therapist, part of honesty and transparency would be around your fees and paying taxes and being insured. So do not lie about being insured and do the honest and transparent thing and pay your taxes. This brings us on to ethical principle number 4, which is do no harm. So, of course, we don't want to do any harm to people, but harm itself is a really changeable, really hazy kind of word. Even thinking about the way we dress for a therapy session, you might want to ask yourself, is what I'm wearing going to cause harm to the client? Does my t-shirt have an offensive slogan on it? Am I aware of the privileges in the room or the power imbalance? So, approaching things from a politically and socially aware perspective, you don't want to cause any harm by denying or being ignorant of the client's experience, lived experience. Misgendering a client. To misgender somebody would be causing harm to them. So, all of these things we need to bear in mind, which links to the next ethical principle of best interest. Always working within the best interest of the client. And this allows us to take a person-centered approach or a client-centered approach in considering what's within their best interest, because not every intervention would suit every client. And you might even want to ask them, oftentimes you should ask the client, what is it that you want? What would be best for you? However, sometimes working in somebody's best interest might be doing something that the client doesn't realize is what's needed. The next ethical principle is the one of respect. Respecting the client, respecting the time that you have for them, respecting their autonomy, respecting their lived experience, respecting their want to end therapy whenever they want. We can never force somebody to be there. To respect them through the language you use, to respect them as an equal, and to not be implementing this power dynamic between you both of I'm the therapist, they're the client. The next ethical principle, so we are on number 7, is fairness. Fairness, or I think in the 2018 ethical framework, this was called justice. To be fair is to ensure that you're not charging one client more than another client. You might want to offer a lot of different ways to have therapy, whether that's telephone, over the phone, over Zoom, or in person, thinking about accessibility needs and making sure it's fair, the fair and just treatment of all clients, ensuring that you are treating everyone fairly, treating them the same. And this includes having an awareness of anti-oppressive practice, which is the next ethical principle, number 8. I'm really glad that this has made the 2026 ethical framework as its own ethical principle, because anti-oppressive practice means that we're aware of the systemic privilege that might be going on in the room. We're aware of race, of gender, of socioeconomic factors, and of different contextual, cultural, spiritual, sexual backgrounds. And without knowing, we could be oppressing the client in ways that we don't even realize, and we can be blinded by our own privileges. Are you aware of your own ignorance or blind spots? And doing your own research in your own time to build knowledge of that so that you can create an anti-oppressive, empathic, non-judgmental bond between you and the client. The 9th ethical principle is that of trust. And just reflecting on how much trust is put on you as the therapist. Trust in keeping the work confidential. Trust that you are qualified to do this work. There is a lot of trust put in therapists and counsellors, rightfully so, hopefully. So the 10th ethical principle is that of collaboration, which links very much into the first part of the ethical framework, which is working ethically within relationships. And every therapist, I don't know if you know this, but every therapist in the UK must see their clinical supervisor for at least an hour and a half a month. I think that works out as maybe an hour and a half every 8 clients or something like that. Me, for example, I see my supervisor twice a month. And it's important that we do that and we have that collaboration in order to be held accountable, in order to make sure we are doing work that's for the best interest of the client. And sometimes having a second opinion or having somebody who's more experienced than you are give their thoughts and feelings about the work you're doing, that's invaluable. It sort of encourages all the other ethical principles for honesty, transparency, not doing harm, working within best interest. You're respecting the client because you've got somebody else there backing up the work that you do. Ethical principle number 11 is compassion. I think that speaks for itself. For your clients, maybe even having compassion for yourself, considering your own capacity, not blaming yourself if something doesn't quite go right in practice, giving people, including yourself, the benefit of the doubt. Compassion perhaps could be linked to unconditional positive regard, which probably I think would become much easier if you had compassion for somebody. Empathizing with someone, I also think, becomes easier when you have compassion for them. You're probably quite a compassionate person if you want to get into this line of work anyway. And ethical principle number 12 is that of integrity, being honest and having strong moral principles that you do not change. Yeah, I suppose the do not change part is going to be key as a final point. So integrity is not only having these ethical principles but not changing them. And you may come up against clients or ethical dilemmas where you'll think, ugh, I don't want to be honest that I've made this mistake, or this client has said how cheap my sessions are, maybe I could charge them more. That wouldn't demonstrate integrity. It's doing the right thing, doing what's fair, doing what's respectful, doing what's honest across the board with all clients, treating everyone the same. There we go. This isn't the entire ethical framework because it's very chunky. We'll let you look at that yourself in your own time. But those are the 12 ethical principles to think about. Confidentiality, honesty, transparency, do no harm, best interest, respect, fairness, anti-oppression, trust, collaboration, compassion, and integrity. They all sound good to me. If you want to read the full 2026 BACP Ethical Framework, I would recommend accessing that if you're on, well, whatever level you are in your training, and you can download it off the BACP website. In the next video, I think I might move on to Unit 2. I'll come back to Unit 1 criteria in other videos, but I think it's important we look at the boundaries of the therapy and counselling role. So I think that's what I'll be talking about next time. So there we go, take 2 of the Ethical Framework video. Thanks for being here. If you have any questions or any thoughts about this, let me know. This new 2026 Ethical Framework's hot off the press. As I say, it came out on Tuesday this week. It's now Saturday, the 8th of August, 2026. Okay, thanks for being here. I hope you've had a lovely week, and I will speak to you next time. Okay, bye.